The courtroom buzzed with the faint hum of murmurs and shuffling papers. It was a busy Tuesday morning, and Judge Raymond Carter, a man in his mid-50s with a sharp, no-nonsense demeanor, presided over the cases like clockwork. Known for his strict approach and impatience for delays, Judge Carter rarely gave anyone more than a few moments of his attention. The next name on the docket was called Olivia Jackson. A poised black woman in her mid-30s stood up from the back of the room. Dressed in a simple navy blazer and pencil skirt, her presence was quietly confident. She walked to the front of the courtroom with a calm expression, carrying herself as though she had been in similar settings many times before. Yet there was no sign of arrogance, only a quiet, unshakable calm. As Olivia approached the bench, Judge Carter barely glanced up from the file in front of him. "Ms. Jackson, you've been charged with failing to stop at a red light," he stated, his tone clipped. "How do you plead?" "Your Honor, I'd like to explain," Olivia began, her voice steady and respectful. But the judge, already tapping his pen impatiently, interrupted her. "There's no need for explanations, Ms. Jackson. The officer's report is clear. You didn't stop at the red light, which is a violation." Olivia paused for a moment, her expression still calm. "With respect, Your Honor, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. I did stop, but there was a pedestrian crossing the street at the time." Judge Carter cut her off again, his tone sharp. "This isn't the place for debates, Ms. Jackson. The rules are the rules. I'll be issuing you a fine of $200 for the violation." The room grew silent as people exchanged glances. It wasn't unusual for Judge Carter to dismiss explanations quickly, but this time there was a palpable tension in the air. Olivia's calmness seemed to stand in stark contrast to the judge's brusque attitude. "Very well, Your Honor," Olivia said, her tone still composed. "I'll pay the fine." She stepped back from the bench, thanked the judge, and walked toward the exit without a hint of frustration. Her grace under pressure caught the attention of several people in the courtroom, including a few young lawyers seated at the back. They whispered among themselves, their eyes following her as she left. Judge Carter moved on to the next case without a second thought. To him, Olivia Jackson was just another name on a long list of cases for the day. He had no idea who she really was, or the lesson he was about to learn. As Olivia exited the courtroom, the whispers among the lawyers grew louder. "Do you know who that was?" one young man asked his colleague. "That's Olivia Jackson. She's the head of the State Bar Association." His colleague's eyes widened in shock. "No way. She didn't even mention it. Why didn't she say something?" "She didn't need to," the young man replied, shaking his head with a small smile. "She let her actions speak for her." Back inside the courtroom, Judge Carter carried on, oblivious to the realization spreading among his staff and the lawyers. But the day was far from over, and soon he would learn exactly who Olivia Jackson was, and it would leave him questioning everything about how he handled justice. The quiet courtroom returned to its rhythm as Olivia stepped out, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. She had left the courtroom without raising her voice, showing no signs of irritation or frustration. Her calm, collected demeanor remained intact, as though the fine she had just been issued didn't bother her at all. Outside, Olivia stopped by the payment counter. A young clerk behind the desk greeted her with a polite smile, though his eyes betrayed curiosity. He had heard the whispers from the back of the courtroom. "Ms. Jackson," the clerk said, cautiously testing her name. "That was something back there. The judge didn't even let you explain." Olivia met his gaze and offered a reassuring smile. "It's all right," she replied simply. "Sometimes people don't listen. That doesn't mean I need to lose my composure." Her words carried a quiet weight, as if they came from years of experience. The young clerk nodded, impressed by her grace, though he still found himself wondering why someone so composed would quietly accept such treatment. Meanwhile, back in the courtroom, the murmurs among the lawyers grew louder during the recess. Whispers about Olivia Jackson spread like wildfire. "She's the head of the State Bar Association," said one lawyer, leaning into his colleague. "What? Seriously?" The other lawyer replied, disbelief evident in his tone. "Why didn't she say anything? If it were me, I'd have made sure the judge knew exactly who I was." "That's not her style," the first lawyer explained. "I've heard about her. Olivia Jackson doesn't throw her title around. She believes in humility and professionalism, no matter the situation." Their words carried through the room, and before long, even some court staff began to catch wind of the revelation. Judge Carter, however, remained unaware of the growing buzz. Later that day, Judge Carter sat in his chambers, reviewing the cases from the morning. He barely remembered Olivia Jackson. Just another name, another case. But as he worked through the files, there was a knock at the door. "Come in," he called, not looking up. A young clerk stepped in, nervously clutching a file. "Excuse me, Your Honor." The clerk began hesitantly, "But I thought you might want to know something about one of the cases today." Judge Carter raised an eyebrow, still distracted by his paperwork. "What is it?" The clerk hesitated, then said, "The woman you fined earlier, Olivia Jackson. She's the president of the State Bar Association." For a moment, Judge Carter froze. Slowly, he put down his pen and looked up at the clerk. "The Bar Association," he repeated, his voice quieter now. "Yes, Your Honor," the clerk confirmed. "She's highly respected in the legal community. I thought you should know." Judge Carter leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Memories of Olivia's calm expression and dignified demeanor came rushing back. He hadn't given her the chance to speak. He had dismissed her too quickly, assuming she was just another defendant. The realization settled heavily on his shoulders. For the first time in years, Judge Carter felt a twinge of regret. As the clerk left the chambers, Judge Carter sat in silence, his thoughts tangled. He realized that his assumptions had blinded him. And though he didn't know it yet, this was just the beginning of the lesson Olivia Jackson would teach him, without ever needing to raise her voice. The following morning, the courtroom felt quieter than usual. A strange undercurrent of energy ran through the air, as if something had shifted overnight. Judge Raymond Carter entered his courtroom, as he always did, with his usual stern expression. He surveyed the room quickly, noting the usual faces of lawyers, clerks, and a few spectators. But today, there was something different. As he took his seat and began to review the cases, he couldn't help but notice the hushed conversations in the corners of the room. People seemed to be speaking in softer tones than usual, exchanging quick glances. A few young lawyers at the back were pointing toward him and then glancing at the door. Their quiet whispers reached his ears. "Did you hear?" one of the younger lawyers asked another. "Yeah, I heard it last night," the second lawyer replied. "She's the head of the State Bar Association." The first lawyer leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "No way. That's Olivia Jackson, the one from yesterday. She's the one the judge fined, right?" "Yes, that's her. You'd think the judge would know who she is before making a decision," the second lawyer said, shaking his head. "She's not someone to ignore. She's done incredible things for the legal community." Judge Carter's brow furrowed. He didn't understand. How could he have missed something so important? How could he not have known the woman he had fined was the head of the State Bar Association? At that moment, another lawyer who had overheard the conversation joined in. "You're right," he said. "Olivia Jackson has worked hard for years, and everyone knows her for her integrity and leadership. She doesn't let her position get in the way of treating people with respect, though. I've heard her speak at legal events before. Her humility is remarkable." The young lawyers exchanged surprised looks, each realizing that they hadn't recognized the woman in the courtroom for who she really was. They now saw her in a new light. Olivia wasn't just an ordinary person walking into the courtroom. She was someone who had earned the respect of countless professionals in her field, someone who had worked tirelessly to improve the legal system. Judge Carter sat quietly at his bench, the words of the lawyers echoing in his mind. His thoughts raced back to the previous day. Olivia Jackson had been calm, composed, and professional. She hadn't tried to flaunt her title or use her position to get special treatment. Instead, she had accepted the fine with grace, despite his dismissive attitude toward her. The judge couldn't help but feel a sense of discomfort. Had he been too quick to judge her? He had made assumptions based on her appearance and demeanor. He had ignored her polite attempt to explain her situation, brushing it off as unimportant. Now, with the knowledge of who she truly was, he realized that he had misjudged her entirely. As the morning wore on, the courtroom continued to buzz with hushed conversations. People who had been in the room during Olivia's case now spoke of her with respect, admiration, and awe. Even the court staff began to murmur about her achievements, recognizing that she wasn't someone to be taken lightly. But for Judge Carter, the realization was hard to shake. He felt a pang of regret. He had dismissed a person who, in reality, deserved his respect. His earlier actions suddenly seemed out of place, and he couldn't help but wonder how things might have gone differently if he had taken the time to truly listen. That afternoon, Olivia's name continued to float through the air. Her calm response and dignified attitude had made a lasting impression. And for Judge Carter, the realization that he had misjudged her would be the first step in a journey he never expected to take. A journey that would teach him the importance of fairness, respect, and the value of truly understanding the people who came before him. Later that afternoon, Judge Raymond Carter sat alone in his office, the door closed behind him. The hum of the courthouse seemed far away. His mind was racing, replaying the events from the morning, and more importantly, the conversation he had overheard in the courtroom. He glanced at the stack of cases on his desk, but his thoughts were not on the legal papers. Instead, they kept returning to Olivia Jackson. She hadn't just been another person in his courtroom. She had been someone he should have recognized. But he hadn't. He had been too quick to judge her, and that realization left him feeling uneasy. Judge Carter wasn't used to feeling this way. In all his years on the bench, he had prided himself on his efficiency, his ability to make decisions quickly and firmly. He never second-guessed himself, but now the memory of Olivia's calm expression kept resurfacing. She had shown him respect even when he had not shown it to her. Why didn't I listen? Judge Carter muttered to himself, running a hand through his hair. Why didn't I pay attention? He knew the answer, of course. It wasn't something he liked to admit to himself, but it was clear. He had assumed too much. Olivia was a black woman who appeared to be just another traffic violation case. He hadn't bothered to ask the right questions to truly understand who she was. Instead, he had acted on an assumption. Now, with the full knowledge of her position and achievements, he couldn't help but feel embarrassed. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how wrong he had been. Olivia hadn't asked for special treatment, and she certainly hadn't tried to use her position to get out of her fine. Instead, she had remained graceful, polite, and composed. And in doing so, she had taught him a lesson he hadn't expected. He looked at the clock on the wall. Time was running out for the day's cases, but his mind kept returning to Olivia's behavior. She had been a true professional, the kind of person who didn't need to make a big show of her accomplishments. She simply let her actions speak for themselves. It was then that Judge Carter thought about his own life. He had spent so many years following the rules, enforcing the law, and maintaining control over his courtroom. But in all that time, had he truly been fair to everyone? Had he ever taken a moment to listen? He wondered how many others like Olivia had passed through his courtroom, only to be judged too quickly, their voices unheard. His thoughts drifted back to his own early years as a young lawyer. Back then, he had been hungry for success, eager to prove himself. But he had also been lucky. He hadn't faced the obstacles that many others had. He hadn't been judged before he had the chance to speak. Judge Carter's heart sank as he thought about how Olivia must have felt walking into his courtroom. She had walked in expecting justice, just like anyone else, but instead, she had been dismissed without a fair chance. He wondered how often that happened to people who didn't have the same privileges he did. The more he reflected, the more determined he became. Judge Carter knew he needed to change. It wasn't enough to simply apologize to Olivia. He needed to change the way he viewed everyone who came into his courtroom, whether they were powerful or ordinary. It wasn't about titles or appearances. It was about treating each person with the fairness and respect they deserved. As the day wore on, Judge Carter made a decision. He would make sure that every person who stepped into his courtroom would be heard, no matter who they were. It wouldn't be easy, but he knew it was the right thing to do. And when the next case came before him, he would be ready to listen, to truly listen, before making any judgments. With a deep breath, Judge Carter stood up from his desk, his decision clear. He might have misjudged Olivia Jackson, but that mistake would be his last. He was going to make sure that the next person who walked into his courtroom would never feel unheard again. Olivia Jackson had always known that her journey would be different. Growing up in a small town, she had been taught that if she wanted to succeed, she would have to work harder than everyone else. It wasn't just about being good at what you did. It was about being better. Her parents, both teachers, had instilled in her a deep sense of pride in her education. They told her that knowledge was power, and with it, she could change the world. Olivia listened closely. From a young age, she developed an insatiable curiosity, always asking questions and never accepting answers at face value. Her love for learning wasn't just about excelling in school. It was about understanding the world and how she could make it better. As a child, Olivia was often one of the only black students in her classes. While many of her classmates had their own set of privileges, Olivia had to fight to be heard. But that didn't discourage her. Instead, it made her more determined to prove that she belonged, to show that her ideas and contributions were just as valuable as anyone else's. When it came time for college, Olivia applied to a prestigious law school. It wasn't easy. She faced rejections and doubts along the way. But she pushed forward. She graduated near the top of her class and soon started her career as a lawyer. She worked tirelessly, taking on difficult cases and always going the extra mile for her clients. Her rise wasn't without challenges. Being a woman of color in the legal field meant that Olivia had to constantly prove herself. She had to work harder, speak louder, and often fight against stereotypes. But with each obstacle, she grew stronger and more confident. She became known not only for her brilliant legal mind, but also for her unshakable integrity. Olivia wasn't just a lawyer. She was a role model. It wasn't long before she began gaining recognition in the legal community. Olivia became a leader in various organizations, advocating for fairness and equality within the profession. She didn't just talk about change. She made it happen. She was elected head of the State Bar Association, a position that allowed her to influence policies and mentor the next generation of lawyers. But even with her many achievements, Olivia remained humble. She never let her title or her success define her. She believed that every person, no matter their background or title, deserved respect. Her goal was never to make others feel small, but to empower them to reach their full potential. This approach made her beloved by many, both in the legal world and beyond. Olivia's success wasn't just due to her legal expertise. It was her kindness, her understanding, and her ability to see the potential in others that set her apart. She believed in people. She believed that everyone deserved a chance to be heard, even if they didn't have the same opportunities that others did. When Olivia walked into the courtroom the previous day, she wasn't thinking about her title or her influence. She wasn't there to impress anyone. She was simply there to handle a small matter, something that, in her mind, was no different than the hundreds of cases she had dealt with before. What made Olivia different was that she didn't feel the need to prove herself through her title. She didn't want special treatment. She wanted fairness, and she expected it. But when Judge Carter had dismissed her so quickly, Olivia realized that not everyone shared her perspective. Some people saw her, not as a leader, but as a stereotype to be judged by appearance alone. It wasn't her first time facing prejudice, and it wouldn't be her last. But Olivia wasn't someone to back down. She had learned long ago how to turn every challenge into an opportunity. She wouldn't let the judge's assumptions define her. She would let her actions speak for themselves. And in time, those actions would leave an impression that Judge Carter would never forget. The next day, Olivia Jackson walked into the courtroom again. This time, she wasn't there for herself. She had a case to represent, a client who needed her expertise and leadership. The air felt different as she entered the room. People took notice of her presence, and for a brief moment, the chatter in the courtroom seemed to quiet down. Judge Raymond Carter, who had been deep in his case files, glanced up and saw her standing by the defense table. His heart skipped a beat as he realized it was Olivia again, the woman he had fined the day before, without knowing who she truly was. The realization hit him hard. He hadn't just made a mistake in issuing the fine. He had judged someone far more important than he had realized, and now she was back in his courtroom. His mind raced. What would she think of him now? He had dismissed her so easily, assuming she was just another person with a simple violation. But Olivia wasn't just another person. She was the head of the State Bar Association, a woman who had worked tirelessly to improve the legal system, a woman who deserved his respect. Judge Carter tried to steady himself as the trial began. Olivia, however, remained calm and focused on the case at hand, paying no attention to his internal conflict. She worked with her client, speaking with professionalism and care. She had come for business, not for confrontation. But Judge Carter could feel the weight of his past actions bearing down on him as the day wore on. The trial continued smoothly, with Olivia handling everything expertly. But as the afternoon approached, Judge Carter found himself unable to concentrate. His thoughts were constantly drifting back to yesterday, to the way he had treated Olivia, to how easily he had dismissed her. Finally, during a break in the proceedings, Judge Carter couldn't hold back any longer. He stood up from his bench and walked over to Olivia, who was sitting quietly at the defense table. He cleared his throat, unsure of how to begin. "Ms. Jackson," he said, his voice softer than usual. Olivia looked up at him, surprised by his approach but offering a polite smile. "Yes, Judge," she replied, her tone calm and composed as always. "I owe you an apology," he began, his words slow and deliberate. "Yesterday I made a mistake. I didn't treat you with the respect you deserve. I judged you too quickly, and for that, I am truly sorry." Olivia met his gaze, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she nodded. "I appreciate your apology, Judge Carter," she said, "but I also understand that we all make mistakes." Judge Carter blinked in surprise. He had expected her to be angry or upset, but instead, she responded with the same calm grace she had shown the day before. Olivia's composure left him speechless for a moment. "I'm not asking for special treatment," she continued. "I don't need anyone to treat me differently just because of my position. But I do believe everyone deserves to be heard. And that includes me, just like anyone else." Judge Carter stood there, feeling the wave of humility wash over him. Her words hit him hard. He realized that in his rush to follow the rules, he had forgotten the most important rule of all, to listen. "I'll make sure to do better," he said, his voice sincere. Olivia nodded once again, her eyes meeting his. "I believe you will." With that, she returned to her case, and Judge Carter slowly walked back to his bench. His mind was clearer now. He had learned something valuable that day, something that would stay with him long after the case was over. As the trial continued, Judge Carter felt a renewed sense of purpose. He no longer saw Olivia Jackson just as a person sitting in his courtroom. He saw her as someone who had earned respect not through titles, but through her actions. And he knew that he would never again make the mistake of dismissing someone so easily. The rest of the trial proceeded without incident, but for Judge Carter, the most important lesson had already been learned. Olivia Jackson had shown him, in the quietest way possible, the power of respect and listening. The days that followed were quieter in the courtroom, but for Judge Raymond Carter, they were far from ordinary. His thoughts kept returning to his conversation with Olivia Jackson and her calm, measured response to his apology. It wasn't every day that someone took the time to teach him a lesson without demanding anything in return. Judge Carter had spent years working in the legal system, enforcing the law with an iron fist, confident in his decisions. But now, he couldn't help but think about the way he had treated Olivia the day before. She hadn't needed to prove herself to him. She had simply acted with grace and respect, not seeking any special treatment, just expecting to be heard. As the days passed, Judge Carter found himself questioning his approach to his job. He had always prided himself on being efficient and decisive, but had that come at the cost of fairness? Had he allowed his assumptions about people, based on their appearance, their background, their race, to influence his decisions without truly considering their words or actions? He began to notice the subtle ways in which he had let those assumptions affect his judgments. He realized that Olivia wasn't the first person he had dismissed or underestimated. He had done it before, with other defendants, other people who might not have had the same status or position as others. And it wasn't just about the law. It was about treating every person with dignity, no matter who they were. One afternoon, as Judge Carter sat at his desk reviewing another case, a knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to see Olivia Jackson standing in the doorway, a smile on her face. "Good afternoon, Judge," she greeted him. "Ms. Jackson," he replied, standing up and gesturing for her to come in. "What brings you here today?" Olivia stepped into the room, her presence calm as always. "I just wanted to thank you," she said, her voice warm but sincere, "for your apology the other day. It meant a lot to me." Judge Carter smiled, feeling a sense of relief. He had expected her to be angry, or at the very least uncomfortable. But instead, she seemed at ease. "I'm glad I could offer it," he replied. "But I owe you more than just an apology, Olivia. You've taught me something valuable." Olivia raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Oh, and what's that?" "That the law isn't just about rules. It's about listening. It's about hearing people, no matter who they are," he said, leaning forward slightly. "I've spent so much time enforcing the law that I forgot the most important part: fairness. I've made judgments without listening to the full story." Olivia's smile softened as she nodded. "I'm glad to hear that, Judge. That's what I believe too. The law should never be about power or position. It should be about people. And sometimes, just listening is the most important thing we can do." Judge Carter leaned back in his chair, feeling a weight lift from his chest. He had spent so many years thinking he knew what was best, but now he realized he still had a lot to learn. Olivia's lesson had opened his eyes to something he had overlooked for far too long. As Olivia left his office that afternoon, Judge Carter felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. He knew that he would approach every case from now on with more thoughtfulness and care. He would listen before making judgments, not just about the law, but about the people who came before him. Olivia Jackson had shown him that the greatest strength wasn't in power or authority. It was in understanding, respect, and humility. And that was a lesson Judge Carter would never forget. In the weeks that followed, Judge Raymond Carter made a quiet but important change. He began to approach his work with a new perspective, one that prioritized fairness, respect, and listening above all else. It wasn't easy. Old habits die hard, and there were moments when he found himself falling back into his old ways, making quick decisions, assuming things based on first impressions. But each time, he reminded himself of Olivia Jackson, the lesson she had taught him, and the promise he had made to himself to be better. His cases began to feel different. He found himself paying more attention to the small details, listening more carefully to the words of those who came before him. He looked at every defendant as an individual, not just a case number, and he considered their words, their circumstances, and their intentions. He realized that every person who stood in front of him had a story to tell, one that deserved to be heard. Judge Carter wasn't perfect. He still made mistakes. But the difference now was that he took the time to correct them, to apologize when he was wrong, and to learn from those mistakes. And slowly, over time, he earned back the trust of the people who came before him. One afternoon, A few months later, Olivia Jackson returned to the courtroom for another case. This time, she wasn't just representing a client. She was there to observe. As she entered the room, she couldn't help but notice the difference in the atmosphere. There was something quieter, more respectful in the air. Judge Carter was still as stern as ever, but there was a certain calmness about him now, a calmness that seemed to come from within. Olivia took her seat in the gallery, watching the proceedings with a keen eye. She was impressed by what she saw. Judge Carter handled each case with care, asking thoughtful questions and taking the time to listen to the people who came before him. It wasn't just about making quick decisions anymore. It was about understanding the bigger picture. After the case ended, Olivia made her way down to the bench, where Judge Carter was sitting, reviewing the next set of papers. When he looked up and saw her, his face lit up with a smile. "Ms. Jackson," he greeted her warmly. "I didn't expect to see you today. How are you?" Olivia smiled back. "I'm doing well, thank you. I just wanted to stop by and say thank you again." Judge Carter raised an eyebrow in confusion. "Thank me? For what?" "For the changes I've seen in you," Olivia said, her voice genuine. "I've been watching, and I can tell you've been making an effort to listen more, to treat people with respect. That's not something you can fake. It's real." Judge Carter felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. "I've learned a lot from you, Olivia. More than I ever expected. I owe you for opening my eyes." Olivia shook her head. "You don't owe me anything. You've done the work yourself. It's been inspiring to see." The two shared a quiet moment, both knowing that this wasn't just about the courtroom anymore. It was about the deeper lessons they had learned, the importance of fairness, humility, and the power of truly listening to others. As the days turned into weeks, Judge Carter continued to grow. He became a better judge, and more importantly, a better person. He understood now that justice wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about understanding people, seeing them for who they truly were, and offering them the respect they deserved. And as for Olivia, she continued her work, leading the Bar Association with the same grace and integrity that had earned her the respect of everyone she encountered. But now, when she entered Judge Carter's courtroom, she saw not just a judge, but a man who had learned and grown, someone who had listened and changed for the better.